Right. Yes, so thanks a lot, Fritz, for the introduction. So I'm Peter Sestoft, and the paper in the proceedings is written together with Harald Søndergaard, who plays a big role in what I'll talk about now. But he emigrated to Australia 37 years ago, and it's quite a distance to London. The most important person in the history is Neil Deaton Jones, who Fritz already introduced. So let's see, this thing is a little in the way. So what I'll talk about here is, and Fritz almost did this already, prehistory, so that's before I came into it. Then what happened at DQ, the department, CS department at University of Copenhagen in the 70s and 80s, and then a description of the department, and then talk specifically about partial evaluation, where Neil and Harald and I come into the work with some personal recollection, so I hope you will bear with that. So partial evaluation probably doesn't need much introduction, but just to underscore what Fritz said, that this was sort of given a name actually already in the 60s, but what Futamura did in 71, apart from giving this equation, was to propose the Futamura projections, at least the first two of them, where specializing an interpreter with respect to a program gives a compiled program, a target program, and specializing a specializer with respect to an interpreter gives a compiler. And later on, when he was at Harvard, he added the third Futamura projection. Specializing a specializer with respect to itself produces a compiler generator. And early work in the 70s on this was mostly in the Soviet Union, in Moscow and Novosibirsk. Turchin and people in Moscow, Yashov and others in Novosibirsk, and people in Linköping, not so far from Copenhagen, worked on partial evaluation. But until 83, nobody had made a non-trivial realization of these the self-application that's involved in the second and third Futamura projection. So before I talk about what happened after 83, I'll talk a little bit about the CS department at the University of Copenhagen, where I myself is educated. I am educated, and also a bunch of you guys here are actually from there. So because Harald and I thought when you wrote the paper that this actually played a role in how this came to be. The department is established in 70 by Peter Nauer, and Peter Nauer had detailed plans for everything. So there's a little book called Plans and Ideas for the Computer Science Department, roughly 100 pages about how everything should be done in the department. Student project activity was core to his vision for this. So there's also a paper in an Italian conference about this. So the project activity has been core to this all the time. And then there was a new Danish university law from 70 also, and that's a coincidence. I think Nauer would not actually didn't like this law, but it has very strong focus on decentralization and democracy. So the so-called department council consisted of all faculty plus making up half the council, and 25% administrative workers and 25% students, and everybody had a voting right there. And at DQ even, and that was unique, in 1 year, a student was elected department head. A unique case. It worked really well, but there was a newspaper article about it, so it was strange even by the standards of the time.
And they changed the law?
Yeah. Later in 2003, the law was made much more corporate and professional, and you are welcome to put quotes on these terms if you want. So we don't work under this any longer. As department head, I can be sort of emperor in the modern system. So continuing about the department, it was housed in an old factory, not a university building, but it was very cozy and impractical. There was a student-run cafeteria where you basically put money in a box when you took something, and hopefully you would pay, but it seemed to work. There was lots of student teaching assistants in courses, primarily I think for lack of faculty, but also to provide ample feedback on those student projects. And one of the things that now are built into the program was so-called PEPM'24, student peer review. So when a student had made a project or a group of students, other students had to assess this project and give a preliminary assessment, maybe not grades. There was also the first instance of a musical or specs or revue. The first instance in the science faculty was at DICU, an annual event making fun of teachers' rules, the ministry, sort of really an anti-authoritarian thing, co-produced between students and faculty, and it's still running. And the result of all this was that there were tons of informal connections between different student cohorts. So I started at university in 81, and Sestoft 2 years before, but I couldn't know him because of all of these informal interactions, and lots of interactions between students and faculty. So, and here starts the PEPM relevant part. So this is just a very short sort of overview of this. The first important thing is that Neil joins the DICU faculty in 82. And I was an undergraduate student at the time. And so I was subjected in fall of 83 to this. Neil wrote some lecture notes about functions, expressions, programming languages, and computability, covering a huge amount of things in 100 pages here. Including what will be relevant later, recursive systems of equations, compilation and interpretation and stuff. I really loved this stuff. It was so neat and compact and clear. Lisp was used as a meta language everywhere, but Neil, like many sensible people, found that Lisp wasn't perfect, so we defined an extension with static Lisp-scoped let bindings and pattern decomposition, calling letlisp, and a preprocessor for that written in letlisp, of course, to turn it into Lisp. And all of the entire setup was totally wonderful. Then, in fall of 83, Neil heard about partial evaluation from Andrei Yashov, possibly at the IFEP conference in Paris, and also that self-application, the second and third Futamura protections hadn't been realized. Independently, I think Niels Andersen, an associate professor in the department, held a seminar course called Automatic Programming. And Harald Søndergaard, one of the co-authors of this paper, was actually, according to the schedule for this course, presented a Yashov's 82 TCS paper, which I think maybe Niels Andersen discovered independently of all the other things. And Neil and Harald got together trying to realize a self-applicable mix, actually in a sense as a student project. Neil didn't have a group at the time, he didn't have any funding, and also had to sort of work with volunteers. And the hope was to be ready for Pobble a few months later, but it turned out to be too difficult to make a self-application work. And so I was totally unaware of this until what I think is January afternoon in 84. I encountered Sestoft discussing this really exciting idea of writing a specializer in the first place, which seemed crazy, and then applying it to itself to achieve compilation and so on. So I learned about it there. At the same time, or soon after, I'm not completely sure about the dates, Mads Rosendahl and Torben Mogensen work on a mix for a Pascal-like language with Lisp data. Somehow I managed to gate crash Harald and Niels' collaboration. I wonder how I dared do that, but maybe because of a short power distance in the department. And so we started working on this, and had really a lot of unsuccessful attempts on the way, which I'll specify a little more later. Somehow, during the summer or fall 84, we managed by inventing a bunch of things, annotations, binding time analysis, and other things, and succeeded with this. In the beginning, call unfolding was controlled manually by annotations on calls, but then later, maybe 85, we managed to automate that as well. And I have very few documents from the time giving precise dates of anything. I've thrown away all papers from that time. So here are quotes from a couple of those student reports, project reports. That Harald wrote a report published in November 84 that says that during the autumn of 84, a far more successful approach has been elaborated by Neil Jones and Peter Sestoft, but this is false. It's Harald being too modest. Of course, he was part of that. Also, Dybkjær writes the year after, it's the summer of 84, a self-applicable one, and Mogensen in his thesis in 86 says late 84. So it's sometimes in 84 we managed to realize non-trivial self-application, and therefore the second and third Futamura projections. And then we grabbed the nearest conference deadline and submitted a paper to Rewriting Techniques and Applications, May 85. So there's a draft of the paper from January 85. So we must have succeeded before December, I think, and wrote this paper and submitted it, and it was accepted for this conference in Dijon. Rewriting Techniques and Applications is sort of relevant, but not sort of, well, I think this paper is maybe considered relevant for this conference, but not sort of core. But it's the most cited paper from that instance of the conference. Okay, so taking a breath and a step, look back. Why did we succeed in doing this? So I think there are at least four aspects to that. One is the design of the language handled by MIX. That's extremely important. The language that MIX is processing must also be the language in which it's written, if it's to be self-applicable. So the language should be simple to handle, but powerful enough to express conveniently a partial evaluator. So that's the same as, I think Turchin had this metaphor of an airplane engine. It must be lightweight to be lifted by the plane, but it must be strong enough to lift the plane. So that's what designing the language was not trivial, actually. Couldn't just take Pascal or whatever was a full Lisp that was around at the time. Using Lisp data was core, and that you saw Neil use those in the computer science notes for the third-year program, third-year course, and that was a really good idea. There was an earlier attempt, which I'll show, that was too simple for experimentation, and then we came up with a somewhat stronger core language, L, to be handled by MIX, and the same idea of a preprocessor translating an extended version of this language into the core language. So we were primed for these ideas by Neil's work on the course, for instance, and his general approach to things. And I'll show the here's the early 84 subject language. So in an attempt to make the language as simple as possible, it actually didn't. It had only one syntactic category, expressions, and a program had one unnamed function, which had one unnamed parameter, and recursive call was executing with this recursion expression. So this language was really simple, and here's a self-interpreter written in a let extended version of this language. So this has you can bind variables and so on, and there's a preprocessor translating that into this. A self-interpreter is interesting because any good partial evaluator will have to be able to evaluate stuff. So somehow it must be an extension of a self-interpreter. And so that's a good thing to start writing in your subject language. But this turned out to be too cumbersome to work with. Even though you can encode everything in one parameter using Lisp cons, and then take it apart using car and coda and so on. This was too cumbersome to work with, and self-application wasn't realized there. Later, maybe in the summer, we decided that this language was too simple and switched to one that was slightly more complex. It's still a very small subset of Lisp, side effect free, but now it has multiple named functions. So a program is a list of function definitions, and each function has multiple named parameters. So a function definition is a function and a list of parameters and an expression. And here's a self-interpreter in this language. It's twice as long as the other one, but this was manageable. And just the convenience of having names for things was extremely important for experimentation, because we needed to make a lot of experiments to get anywhere. Actually, switching from the early 84 language to the late one with multiple functions, multiple named functions, made program point specialization possible. And that wasn't possible in the first one without tons of encoding. And this is a super important way and convenient way of specializing programs. And most of the specializers written at DECO later were of this sort. This approach to partial evaluation was invented at the same time by Mikhail Polyonkov in Novosibirsk. Then we introduced annotation of operations, I'll get back to that, and binding time analysis and binding time improvements. So let's see if I can explain this. So the problem after getting a good enough language to work with was how to decide what to do with data. So when we have an expression like car of cons of xy, and x has value 2, should this be reduced to 2 or left as a residual expression? So reduce or not reduce. Or function calls, should they be unfolded or inlined or left as a function call where we know that x is 2 and z is car of w or something. These decisions can be taken online, and that was the standard until then, that the partial evaluator, the running mix, had enough information to decide whether this was the best approach or that, but based on the values of x, y, and z, and perhaps other things. But at least we weren't clever enough to write a self-applicable mix in this approach. So applying online decisions mix to itself proved too difficult. Producing either trivial programs that was just basically the given program with a constant added at the beginning, like Kleene's proof of the SMN theorem, or it produced large or even infinite residual programs. Something looping was the standard thing. And I recall, as I write also in the paper, in one of these many experiments over the summer and fall, I started a self-application computation on the PDP, the VAX computer we had just got at the department. Went to lunch, and when I came back from lunch, I was an angry computer operator because my program, which I'd written to disk, had filled all the remaining disk space in the entire department. So that's probably a very large program has resulted, but not an infinite one, because an infinite one wouldn't have terminated. So the idea was to let annotation decide. And I think this is typical Neil approach to things. Let's see, here's some problem that is impossible to handle. We don't understand it, but what if we help this partial evaluator a bit, and then we'll figure out later how to make this help automatic. So the idea was to decorate operations with S for static and D for dynamic, and then one can have car S of cons S, and then that will reduce to 2 if X is 2, but if you have car D applied to cons D, then you get the entire expression instead, and maybe the value substituted in here, 2 and 5. And then you have a 2-level language was invented here, and that made self-application possible, and I'll try to explain why in a moment. Because of first thing was that this was cheating, because we were helping the computer too much, so of course we wanted to automate this, and so we invented binding time analysis, and this wasn't foreign to Neil at all either. He had been working with explicit binding times previously, but we wrote this simple analysis that can compute the binding time of values and then automatically annotate the operations using these computed binding time values. Function call annotation, as I said, was a separate problem. So the question is why this actually works. And I think we didn't totally understand it at the time, but here's an attempt to reconstruct what works. By introducing a binding time analysis as a pre-step to a partial evaluation, we actually give a mix an extra parameter. So in addition to the program to specialize and the data, the partial data to the program, we give it a binding time description, and then a separate stage. The annotate can analyze the given program and the binding time description, maybe SD, saying the first argument is static and the second is dynamic, and produce an annotated residual, an annotated program to be specialized. And then the specializer proper will work on this annotated program. That's exactly how our mix came to work. And then there are some specialized equations for this. So with a 3-argument mix, the Fujimura projections look slightly different. So specializing an interpreter with respect to a program, we also need to give it a binding time description, SD, telling a mix that the interpreter's first argument is there, namely the program, but the second argument, namely the program's input, is not there. Compiler generation is a question of specializing this mix, given only the interpreter but not the program. So we actually have 2 arguments here. We have the interpreter and its binding time description. And therefore this mix being specialized as the input description, static, dynamic, because we have the interpreter, we have the binding time description, but we don't have the program. And so this is what makes a difference. And specializing, in this case, specializing this mix with respect to itself, but not the interpreter, means specializing. So this is this one, and this mixes this one, and this one is the binding time description. So we specialize this mix with respect to itself and the binding time description, but not the interpreter and its binding time description. And compiler generation and so on works on, again, on a tuple of the interpreter and the binding time description, or a tuple of the partial evaluator and its binding time description. And I think that is the important part, that this binding time description from the interpreter is preserved when we specialize the mix with respect to the interpreter, and this binding time description from the mix is preserved when we specialize mix with respect to itself. Because it tells us that the compiler being created here by mix should expect a program marked by S as input, but not the program's input, which is marked D. And so the compiler has a lot, so this mix this mix is being partially evaluated by this one, and this one has a lot more information at hand when making decisions on how to transform the interpreter during partial evaluation. So we get a compiler that works like a normal compiler. It takes a program as input, but not the program's data. Without this, basically mix would be obliged to produce a compiler that could also take the program's input as argument and produce a residual program. Then, when given the program, will run it on the data, which is not what we expect to get, and a much more complicated object. In reality, we didn't work with 3-argument mix, but with annotated programs, but the equations are exactly the same, and the important part is the annotation on the interpreter and on the mix given as argument there. function call annotation, function call unfolding decisions were first made manually by writing an annotation on the call expressions. And then later we found a relatively complex way of doing this. Looking back, it's super simple, but I found it very complex at the time. Unfold a call if there's a static argument that does structural descent in its argument and everything else is equals. And later we found out it was actually much simpler to unfold a call if it's under static control, if and only if. And then if you look at the appendix of the Jones-Kumar-Sestoft book from '93, the specializers shown there uses this simpler approach. I think one reason we didn't invent the simpler approach is that even our late '84 language didn't have let bindings, proper let bindings, and therefore function calls also had the role of, if you had a very expensive computation, you wanted to do it once and use it twice, you needed a function call there, and therefore call unfolding should also avoid duplicating code and computations. If our language had let bindings, this extra restriction could be ignored, and I think we would probably have invented the simpler solution earlier. So even our late '84 language is actually a little too simplistic, I think. Adding a let binding to this language wouldn't make it much more complex, and would make the compiler from that to this simpler, and we would have understood call unfolding better, I think. And if you look back at Torben Mogensen's '86 master's thesis, he actually does have a let binding in his language. So I think Torben understood this better than we did at the time. Which you typically find that Torben understands everything better in retrospect. So, good. What happened afterwards was this workshop that Fritz already mentioned in Fyn, with participants from all over the place. Chairs and editors was, of course, Neil, Andreas Schoff, and Tinus Bjørner, and he was sort of the moving power there. And here's a color photo. It's probably difficult to see from anywhere, but Neil is in the middle here. Turchin, John McCarthy, John Hughes from now in Gothenburg, Andreas Schoff, Futamura, Tinus Bjørner, Bill Shirley's, Sergei Romanenko from Moscow, evaluator, and me in need of a haircut out here on the wing, and tons of other great people. Direct Olivier, and so on. One side effect of this was this kind of excessive recognition that Fritz mentioned, that his advisor came in. So I started I was still a master's student, I hadn't even finished my master's thesis, but I got a lot of mail of this sort to Dr. Sestoft, and invitations for strange things and so on. So that was, of course, great fun. A lot of stuff followed by other people dealing with much more complex languages like full scheme or C, Lars Ole Andersen, Prolog, and the lambda calculus, and tons of other work. Lars Birkedal, here in the audience, wrote a handwriting cogen approach for standard ML. I think that we were lucky that Lisp is dynamically typed, because types do get in the way here, and Lars and Morten Velinder found a great way around that in their handwriting cogen, and tons of other stuff, not PE related. And then Neil decided in '89 to collect all of this knowledge in a book. And this took only 4 years, and this book is authored by Neil and me and Carsten Kumar, who was doing this lambda mix thing here. And there are also contributed chapters. One of the many things that came out of it, apart from partial evaluation, was that Lars Ole Andersen, to make partial evaluation for C, he needed a way to know which pointers pointed where, especially function pointers. And so he wrote a pointer analysis, which is a super cited paper. And Bjarne Stensgaard later made another implementation of such a pointer analysis using techniques from Fritz's type inference work, and those are super cited papers, both of them. And it's basically because this need for partial evaluation of C was perceived at some point. And finally, we are at PEPM here. After the 0th PEPM, a few years passed, and then Olivier Danville and Charles Concel decided to create a symposium as a venue, as a permanent home for this kind of work. And they succeeded extremely well. Thank you.